Back in the 1960s, the BBC launched a new adventure series about a most unusual time traveller. He wore cloaks and frock coats. The series was created by BBC's legendary head of drama, Sidney Newman, and the producer was one Verity Lambert. But this isn't the time travel show you think it is. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. It's time for a second edition of First Impressions. This is the little series that I run within the channel, looking back at first episodes of some legendary and sometimes perhaps not quite so legendary series, looking at the first episodes of certain shows and considering how they set up the format of the series that was to follow and whether they successfully established a new series and set it off on a path to success or failure. I wasn't planning to do a second episode quite this quickly because the first one for Captain Scarlet went up just a few days ago, but I had a fantastic suggestion from one of my subscribers and viewers, Mr. Ian Woodward, and hello Ian. Ian is a loyal viewer of the channel and he's always commenting and offering suggestions, but Ian suggested something that sort of hit me like a lightning bolt, and I thought, yeah, I've got to do this because this is a show that's not really talked about much these days, because it dates back to 1966. And even though episodes are available to view, it's sort of fallen out of favour and just fallen out of people's minds, I think. So I thought, I've got to do this now. I've got to do the first episode of this series because it is a cracking first episode. I'm talking about Adam Adamant Lives, a BBC series that debuted on the 23rd of June 1966 and was done and dusted by March the following year after a pretty impressive run of 29 episodes across 2 seasons. You may have heard the name Adam Adamant. I'll just tell you a little bit about the show and what it was. As I mentioned, Sidney Newman was the head of drama at the BBC at this time. He had already gifted us Doctor Who. He created The Avengers for ITV years earlier. And he came to the BBC with a personal mission that he wanted to beef up the BBC's drama schedules, make them a bit more populist. The BBC had often shied away from that sort of thing. It felt it was a bit more cultural than the sort of vulgar stuff that was on ITV. But this was a time of ratings, and the channel wanted ratings. They wanted people watching their output. And Sidney Newman, having created The Avengers, felt that BBC needed something of that ilk. An adventure series for adults, adventurous, action-packed, that would be not exactly a rival to The Avengers, but an answer to The Avengers, or a BBC alternative to it. There were lots of plans thrown around at BBC Television Centre, and the BBC were trying to get the rights to Sexton Blake, a barely remembered detective from the turn of the century, the early 20th century, a character who was in turn a rival to Sherlock Holmes, who was so phenomenally popular at the time. They couldn't get the rights to Sherlock Holmes, so they decided to come up with something new, and they couldn't come up with any ideas. Legend has it that Sidney Newman was sitting in his office at Television Centre and gazing through the window, and he saw some workmen working on a nearby building site with drills and hammering away at concrete and so on. An idea floated into his head. What would happen if, during their excavations, they discovered a man frozen in a block of ice, a man who'd been cast adrift in time decades before and suddenly woke up to find himself in the swinging 60s of London? A great idea. I think you'll agree. Suitably emboldened, he set about crafting this into a Saturday night adventure series. He brought on board the likes of Donald Cotton, who had been writing for Doctor Who not long before, and Tony Williamson, who would have lots of experience writing adventure shows in the 60s. Who to produce? Well, Verity Lambert had not long left Doctor Who. She'd made a pretty good job of Doctor Who, so he entrusted her with this new series, and she was intrigued by the idea. She thought there was a lot of interesting potential in the idea of the fish out of water. Well, a traveller from the future who comes back to the past and has to come to terms with the 20th century, or vice versa, somebody from the 20th century catapulted forward in time who has to understand what the future has in store. It's a great idea and it's full of fantastic dramatic possibilities. What to call this series? Well, a number of names were bandied about, including Dick Daring, Rupert Diath, and Magnus Hawk, which I think is actually not a bad choice. And eventually, Sidney Newman settled upon Adam Adamant because it reflected adamantium, which has the hardness and toughness of diamond. The series slowly started to come together. Cast as the hero of the show, Adam Llewellyn de Vere Adamant, was stage actor Gerald Harper. He accepted the role, having been told it would make him a household name and make him rich and famous. He was supposed to be doing a stage play, I think, in America. He ummed and ahed about accepting the role, but eventually was persuaded to take on this TV role. He has the look of a classic Victorian-era adventure. The pinched features, aquiline look, lean, very physical in his actions and his demeanour. The concept of the series was that Adam Adamant, as we will discover, is frozen in ice in 1902, wakes up in 1966. Stumbling around modern-day London, completely baffled, he comes across a young girl called Georgina Jones, a free-thinking, free-spirited girl of the 1960s. She was to be played by Anne Holloway. She's an actress who went on to be well known as one of the daughters in the Patrick Cargill comedy series Father Dear Father. And an episode was filmed with her playing the role of Georgina Jones. But something wasn't quite right, and it was felt that the chemistry wasn't there, the physicality wasn't there between her and Gerald Harper. So the part was recast and the majority of the episode was scrapped. Brought on board now was a young vivacious actress called Juliet Harmer, a real 60s face, a real beat girl, who represented that sort of light permissiveness that they were looking for in the show. The series starts off with a striking title sequence, which itself evokes the Avengers, with images of Adam Adamant indulging in a bit of swordplay in silhouettes, and we see Georgina spinning round. It's very much the John Steed, Emma Peel type effect. And over this title sequence, we have this song, the Adam Adamant theme, which was sung by pop singer Kathy Kirby, who had enjoyed a little bit of success in the 1960s. It's a very memorable song. It's incredibly 60s, and I will put a link to it down below because, of course, copyright gods probably won't like me playing it here. It sets up the melodramatic tone of the series that's going to be played out before us. In the first episode, A Vintage Year for Scoundrels, we start off in a castle in Windsor in 1902. That'd be Windsor Castle then. Adam is in attendance at a glamorous ball being held in the castle with his betrothed Louise, but he sets out the stall of the character as a gentleman adventurer who's come to the aid of the British Empire on more than one occasion when he tells Louise that he can't marry her because his enemies, of which there are many, will use her as a weapon to get at him. No sooner has he made this declaration than the castle is attacked by a couple of blackguards who clamber over the balcony. Adam dispatches them with a few handy punches, and they disappear over the balcony to their doom. The note is signed by Louise, who it appears has been kidnapped. But when Adam arrives at the address, it's a trap. He's incapacitated, laid low by the Face, a monstrous whispering blackguard who tells Adam that he's going to inject him with a serum which will freeze his bodily functions and plunge him into an eternity of nothingness. Before he's plunged into his coma, Adam requests to see Louise one more time. It transpires that Louise is in cahoots with the Face, and the last thing Adam sees before he disappears into unconsciousness is Louise in the arms of the Face. 60 odd years later, we're on a building site, as per Sidney Newman's vision, and some builders working on a new site come across a man frozen in ice. This is Adam Adamant. He's taken to a nearby hospital. Adam Adamant is a well-known figure in history by this point. He's a legend from the early 20th century, a legend who disappeared in 1902. And obviously the medical authorities are confounded and baffled by this man who claims to be Adam Adamant. Adam himself is delirious, but he manages to escape from the hospital. He wanders round Piccadilly Circus, where he is discovered by Georgina Jones, Juliet Harmer, who takes him back to her apartment, and she tends him and looks after him and explains he's in 1966. Adam, of course, is appalled. Adam can't understand the 20th century. He can't understand cars. He can't understand all the neon lights in Piccadilly Circus, the taxis, the traffic lights. It's all foreign and alien to him, and he's just completely at a loss. This is the first half of the first episode, and this is great stuff. This is really well done. It's very atmospherically directed by Maura Armstrong. The location sequences on Piccadilly Circus are great. They're really good, really done in a disorienting style. And in fact, they were done guerrilla style. It was basically Gerald Harper sent out onto the streets on a Saturday night, camera crew just following him discreetly and just watching him as he stumbles across the street, bumping into taxis and just gazing round in awe at everything that's going on in the 1960s. Then he meets Georgina, who's this tomboyish girl free-thinking, a very 1960s girl. And she looks after him in her apartment while she goes off to work at the discotheque. Second half of the story is the sort of secondary plot of the episode. And this is where it sort of runs out of steam a little bit, because this is slightly hokey 1960s melodrama about an extortion racket at the disco where Georgina works. Her grandfather, who works as some sort of pot man, is murdered. Before Georgina can identify the two hoods who have murdered him, she and Adam Adamant are attacked by this racketeer woman and her two assistants. And this becomes a slightly hokey, going nowhere plot, really. But it does establish Adam as a hero, a defender, a righter of wrongs, and he protects Georgina from the attentions of this extortion racket. And it all ends up with a lot of death and a lot of fights. It's an interesting first episode, which does a pretty good job of setting up the series. The first half, as I say, the first half an hour is just so interesting. It's so well done. It's very well filmed. The performances are great. I mean, Gerald Harper is just fantastic casting as Adam Adamant. His performance is great. He's got this look about him, his wild eyes looking round in complete befuddlement at what's going on, and his mannerisms, his body language, the way he moves and twists himself around. It's very much of a man who is at ease with his physicality, but not at all at ease at where he finds himself. And the way he delivers the dialogue, and the dialogue is very sharp and very clever. He feels completely embarrassed at being in the boudoir of a young lady. He can't understand anything about the 1960s, obviously, because he's from 64 years earlier. And he plays out that fish out of water thing very, very well. But the second half of the story is a bit lame. It is a bog standard sort of crime caper that you had in a lot of clunky 1960s dramas. And at the end of the episode, it's clear that Adam and Georgina, who has been a fan of Adam Adamant and she knows about him, she's been to his home, which was demolished years before. There was a plaque saying that Adam Adamant lives here. And it sets up where we are with this series and where we're going to go. I think the problem with the series going forward, and I think this is going to be a first impressions via a retrospective on the series, because I'm not sure that I will revisit the series in any more depth. I think the problem with the series, it was created as an alternative or a rival to the Avengers, but by this point in its history, the Avengers was now becoming a bit glossier, a bit slicker, and a bit more fantastical. Adam Adamant, in contrast, has the production techniques of the very early Avengers episodes, the clunky studio episodes. There's quite a decent mix of studio and film in Adam Adamant, but the studio stuff is still very much studio bound. When you have the fight scenes in the studio, they are very theatrical, people leaping about, slapping. You don't have the sound effects that you would get on a proper film fight sequence. It is all very theatrical and very mannered, as those early Avengers episodes were. So it's a shame that the series came along to rival the Avengers, and yet it wasn't rivaling the Avengers as it had become, but it was rivaling the Avengers as it had been. And I think looking at the storylines of the subsequent episodes, and I do have the box set of the episodes that remain, they're just not weird enough. It doesn't lean heavily enough into the fantasy. A lot of the stories are routine stuff about blackmail and murder and poisoners, international intrigue. There are some which have sort of megalomaniacs who want to take over the world, but it is a bit parochial and a bit unimaginative. When it needed to really spread its wings, it needed to be a bit wilder. And there are issues also with the characterization of Adam Adamant himself. Within a couple of episodes, he's learned to drive. We don't know how. He drives around in a little red Mini, but we've no idea how he's learned to drive, how a man from 1902 would learn to drive a 1960s motor vehicle. He also seems to have an enormous amount of wealth because he rebuilds his own home on top of a new modern car park. So he's got swish apartments there. Presumably he had money salted away, and he's managed to access it, which makes him a wealthy man in 1966. But the stories, the scripts never tell us this. We never understand about this. All of a sudden, oh, he's driving. Oh, he's got a home. It all happens really without us being given any explanation. By the end of the second episode, the triumvirate of the series is completed with the introduction of a character called Sims, a former Punch and Judy man, played by Jack May. He becomes a sort of butler, confidant, advisor to Adam throughout the rest of the series. But I think what lets it down is that the plots are just very mundane and they're not fantastical enough. You do get some right performances from some of the guest stars, and there's at least one episode in the second series which is directed by Ridley Scott. But it is a show that never fulfilled its potential, and in fact I think that's what led to its downfall. It was very successful. I think apparently it had about 12 million viewers in its first season, dipped in the second season. The first season ran for 16 episodes, were very quickly recommissioned for a second run of 13 episodes, but I believe that the ratings started to tail off a bit because I think perhaps now ITC were up and running with their glossier filmed adventure series, such as The Avengers and The Saint, which just looked a bit more accomplished than this clunky, slightly staged series. And I think that the BBC were aware of its popularity but weren't exactly enamoured of the show. It wasn't quite the sort of thing that the BBC wanted to shout about from the rooftops. So I think it was quietly cancelled at the end of its second season. And as is fairly typical for a lot of shows in the 1960s, it suffered from the infamous purging of the original tapes. Of the 29 episodes, 15 episodes exist from the first 16, and only one exists from the second batch of 13. And the pilot episode, starring Anne Holloway, which I'm sure we'd love to see, is long gone, although the actual initial sequence at Windsor was lifted from the original pilot and then planted into the new version, A Vintage Year for Scoundrels. Adam Adamant had an afterlife, of course, a little bit of an afterlife. There was a comic strip that ran, I think, in TV Comic for a little while. There was one Adam Adamant annual, and the series, such as it is, was released on DVD by the BBC many years ago and is still available, but it's a bit pricey. So if you fancy watching Adam Adamant, and you might as well give it a go because it's not bad. It's on YouTube. You'll find all the episodes on YouTube, and you might also be interested to take a look at a documentary called The Cult of Adam Adamant, which was part of a run of documentaries made about 2006 by BBC Scotland, looking at some of the BBC's less remembered science fiction shows like Star Cops and Blake Seven and Survivors and Adam Adamant Lives. It's an interesting experiment. It was a great idea. Adam Adamant is a fantastic idea, but it never quite fulfilled its potential. It never quite got where it should have gone, and possibly because it was low budget. If it had been a bit glossier and a bit bigger and a bit bolder and a bit brasher, I think it could have been a bigger hit, ran for a couple more years and be better remembered. But it's certainly a curio in the history of British television, and if you, like me, are interested in those sort of time-travel-y things about people out of their time period and struggling to cope with a different time period, I think this does it really well. Gerald Harper is superb. Juliet Harmer has a sort of Doctor Who assistant type charm to her. And it's always enjoyable, but it's never outstanding. It's always struck me as well as one of those shows that should have been rebooted years ago. It's the sort of thing that would work perfectly today. I mean, somebody from the early 19th century coming alive in 2024 with the insanity of the modern world, social media, the internet, TV, films, the world as it is at the moment, it would be fantastic if done properly. And I've always thought that the perfect person to play the part, because he has a strange, uncanny resemblance to Gerald Harper in that he has that same sort of look about him, is David Tennant. I don't think that at this stage of his career, David Tennant would really want to commit to another fantasy adventure type character, but he always struck me as sort of champagne casting for a reboot of Adam Adamant, which will probably never happen. The series was rebooted in audio by Big Finish back in 2020. I think they released 2 box sets of 6 episodes, but there haven't been any more. I never listened to them because I don't do that sort of thing, and I don't imagine they were hugely successful. But Adam Adamant has a little corner in the appreciation of cult TV, British cult TV. And if you fancy wandering into that corner to have a look at it, I think you will enjoy it, but don't expect anything that will blow your mind. I think that, like me, you will probably think, oh, this could have been so much better if the scripts had just taken a few more risks. But it's a good fun show, and the performance by Gerald Harper alone is worth seeing because he just leaps off the screen. He throws himself into it with incredible energy, even when the scripts don't always deserve it. That's Adam Adamant Lives, and its pilot episode, I'm going to give its pilot episode, which is probably one of the best episodes of the series, in fact, I'm going to give it 8 out of 10 because it really establishes the format so well in that first half an hour, but it runs out of steam very quickly when you've got this slightly boring, frankly, story about a protection racket. Adam Adamant Lives. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, why not like and subscribe to the channel? If you've just come across this video and thought, oh, Adam Adamant, I remember him. I hope you enjoyed the video and this little retrospective and this look at the first episode. And stick around because there's loads of stuff like this. There will be loads more of these videos looking at one episode of a show, plus retrospectives, film reviews, TV reviews, lots of Doctor Who stuff. So you might as well just stick around, press that like button, press the subscribe button, leave a comment down below. If you want one of these t-shirts, there's a link in the description where you can purchase one at a very reasonable price. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope it's been entertaining. And I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.